This chapter introduces the economic way of thinking along with a few models. The first being the production possibilities frontier and the other being the circular flow diagram. The circular flow diagram is the first of many graphs covered in the textbook. The production's possibilities frontier will be used extensively in Chapter 3, which covers interdependence and the gains from trade. So now we look at the economist as a scientist, and the economist plays two roles. First, as a scientist, they try to explain the world. They're a social scientist. Second role is as policy advisors. They try to improve policy. In the first role, economists employ the scientific method, which is a dispassionate development and testing of theories about how the world works. You may be familiar with this method in more of your hard science classes, like biology, chemistry. The scientific method essentially is a multi-step method where initially you ask a question about something you want to understand a little better. Then you do some background research, otherwise known as a literature review. You then construct a hypothesis or multiple hypotheses. You test the hypothesis with an experiment, and you analyze data and draw a conclusion and report your results. When you analyze the data, you're looking to prove or disprove the hypothesis you came up with. Policy advisors, on the other hand, try to improve policy outcomes by improving the effectiveness and the efficiency of policy. Essentially just trying to see what the costs and benefits of policies are, how they can be improved upon by policymakers. Now, models used by economists generally have a great deal of assumptions, expansive assumptions that is. Assumptions simplify a complex world and make it easier to understand. Generally speaking, a social scientist like an economist or a sociologist have to make analysis in a very dynamic world. An example would be the study of international trade. To study international trade, we assume we can use dumbed down examples, at least on the most basic levels, and assume that there are something like two countries and only two goods. Obviously, this is very unrealistic, and what you would encounter as an economist out in the real world would be much more sophisticated. But as a beginning economics student, we start with simple things like two countries and two goods. It's simple to learn. It gives useful insights about the real world. Now, when we build assumptions and we move towards a model, and a model is a highly simplified representation of a more complicated reality, we can begin to use models to study economic issues. So, you know what they say about economists, and it happens to be true. Economists do it with models. It's a little economics joke, kind of sad, but hey, we're economics geeks. What can we do? Our first model is the circular flow diagram, which is a visual model of the economy and shows how dollars flow through markets, through the market among households and firms. There are two types of actors in the simplified circular flow diagram. There's households and then there's firms. And there are two markets. The markets for goods and services. Typically the households are looking for goods and services. And then there's the market for the quote-unquote factors of production. Labor, inputs, so on and so forth, that the firms need to produce a product, good, or service. Factors of production, again, are the resources the economy uses to produce goods and services. They include labor, land, and capital. Now, we use a very simplified definition of capital on this slide and in this chapter. Just think basically buildings and machines that are used in production. A more formal definition will be provided in subsequent chapters. So, looking at figure 1 here, we're going to take it piece by piece just to try to keep it simple initially. You have two actors, firms and households. Households own the factors of production. They sell and rent them to firms for income. So you sell or rent your time to a firm as an employee, producing whatever that firm produces. And then also as a household, you also are a consumer. You buy and consume goods and services. Now firms buy and hire factors of production and use them to produce goods and services and sell those goods and services on the market. Now this next graph, it's like, whoa, there's a lot going on here. Let's just take it piece by piece. First of all, on the right-hand side, you have your households. On the left-hand side, you have your firms. Let's look at the arrows separately. We will start with the green arrows here, running around the outer side. In this diagram, the green arrows represent the flows of incomes and payments. Now the red arrows represent the flow of goods and services, including services of the factors of production in the lower half of the diagram down here. To keep the graph simple, we've omitted the government, the financial system, the foreign sector, which are discussed on the following slide. So first, let's start with households. So what do households do here? And let's look at the red lines here. Household members in a household, the individuals in a household, provide the labor, land, and capital as markets for factors of production to firms. People get up and they go to work. They may sell their land to a brand new factory. The firms, in turn, use those factors of production to produce goods and services, which they sell in the markets for goods or services that are bought by households. So you can see the circular flow there. Now, going in reverse here, households spend their money in the markets for goods and services, which provides revenues for the firms, which the firms then use portions of those revenues for profit, of course, but also wages and rent to obtain market factors of production, which go to households as income. So around and around we go. Again, the households provide the labor for the firms provide the goods and services, the households buy the goods and services, they spend those, and they provide revenue for the firms, and in turn, income for the households. So a little convoluted graph, when you take it piece by piece, becomes pretty simple. Now, our second model is the production's possibilities frontier. A lot of times abbreviated by PPF. It is a graph that shows the combinations of two goods the economy can possibly produce given the available resources and the available technology. So remember, we're using a very kind of dumbed down example here. We have two goods in two countries. So they can produce more of one good and less of another, and vice versa. Now, in this example, in the slides, which is slightly different from what you see in the book, there are two goods that can be produced. Computers and wheat, obviously two very different goods. There's one resource, labor, which is measured in hours. How much labor does it take to produce computers, and how much labor does it take to produce wheat, and what is the cost associated with that labor? Now, we're going to assume here the economy has 50,000 labor hours per month available for production. Now, the production's possibilities frontier example I'm using in this video, you have producing one computer requires 100 hours of labor, and producing 1 ton of wheat requires 10 hours of labor. So you can divide up those 50,000 labor hours however you want to divide them up, and produce some combination of computers and wheat listed here from A to E. If you went all in with your labor hours for computers, and none for wheat, and your production would be 500 computers and 0 tons of wheat. Conversely, if you went all in with your labor hours in producing wheat, you would produce 0 computers and 5,000 tons of wheat. And then you see the different varying combinations in between. Now, we can graph this. Again, the different points on the graphs here. 500 computers, 0 wheat. All the different combinations all the way down to 0 computers and 5,000 tons of wheat. And you can graph this. You'll see that A is we're producing 500 computers and 0 tons of wheat. At B, we're producing 400 computers and 1,000 tons of wheat. C, 250 and 2,500. D, 100 computers and 4,000 tons of wheat. And then lastly, E, 0 computers and 5,000 tons of wheat. So this is how you choose to, you can allocate your labor hours anywhere along this line, and this line becomes what's known as the production's possibilities frontier. So, looking at point F, you can produce 100 computers, 100 computers and 3,000 tons of wheat. But at point F, you require 40,000 hours of labor. So that's not efficient. You're inside your production's possibilities frontier. So you're not maximizing the total number of labor hours you have available. You're only using 40,000 labor hours when you have 50,000. So this is what's considered inefficient. It's possible, but inefficient. You could get more of either good without sacrificing any of the other. You're leaving some things on the table. Now, another example, look at point G here. You're saying, hey, let's produce 300 computers and 3,500 tons of wheat. Well, that's beyond your production's possibility frontier. It's beyond the frontier. It's beyond what you can do. Point G would require 65,000 hours of labor, and that's not possible because the economy only has 50,000 hours of labor. So if you could think back to the previous graph, point F's inside, point G's outside. If on the test I said, looking at point F and point G, which one's possible? You could say, well, this one's possible but not efficient. And I could ask, is G possible? And you could clearly say, no, it requires 65,000 hours of labor. That's not possible. So the production's possibilities frontier, what we know so far. Points on the productive possibilities frontier like A through E are possible and efficient. All the resources are fully utilized. Remember, our big input resource was hours of labor. Points under the PPF, like F, are possible but not efficient. Some resources are underutilized. You have workers who are unemployed or factories that are idle. Points above the PPF, like G, are simply not possible. So if you remember back in Chapter 1, we introduced opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of an item is what must be given up in order to obtain that item. So as you're moving along the production's possibilities frontier, this involves a shifting of resources. In that example, the very simple example, it's labor. You're shifting labor from wheat production to computer production or computer production to wheat production. So you're moving that from the production of one good to the other. Now, society faces a trade-off. Getting more of one good requires sacrificing some of another good. In this very simple example. The slope of the production possibilities frontier tells you the opportunity cost of one good in terms of another. As you slide up and down the production's possibilities curve, you're trading computers for wheat and wheat for computers depending on which direction you're going. Here, the rise is a negative number because you move to the right and the line falls, meaning the wheat output is reduced. The slope of a line equals the rise over the run. Very simple slope calculation here. the amount the line rises when you move to the right by 1 unit. Here, the opportunity cost of a computer is 10 tons of wheat. Moving to the right involves shifting resources from the production of wheat, which causes wheat output to fall, to the production of computers, which causes computer production to rise. Producing an additional computer requires the resources that would otherwise produce 10 tons of wheat. With additional resources, an improvement or an improvement of technology. So if you got more labor hours, or you found a new technology that allowed you to produce wheat and or computers to have a higher level of production due to technology. Say you got a new fertilizer that increased wheat yields, or you found a new microchip processor that allowed you to build computers faster, whatever it was. The economy can produce more computers and or more wheat, or any combination in between. Here we see an equal shift of the production possibilities outward. It's quite possible that only one could shift and the other stay the same, but here we're seeing what looks to be a proportional shift. The production possibilities frontier shows the trade-off between the outputs of different goods at a given time, but the trade-off again can change over time. So, for example, over time, the economy might get more workers, or more factories, or more land, or a more efficient technology might be invented. Both events, there's an increase in the economy's resources, or an improvement in technology. So this causes an expansion in a set of opportunities. That is both the economy to produce more or one of the goods. This is a simple example, again, of economic growth, an important subject that gets its own chapter in the macroeconomics portion of the economic sequence in the textbook. We'll talk about production and growth. In the example shown on this slide, the economic growth causes a parallel shift of the production possibilities frontier. And since the new PPF is parallel to the old one, the trade-off between the two goods is the same. However, this is not always the case. For example, if a new technology had more impact on the computer industry than it did on the wheat industry, then the horizontal line, the computer intercept, would increase more than the vertical wheat intercept, and the PPF would be a little bit flatter. The opportunity cost of computers would fall because the technology has made them relatively cheaper. Again, this is an example of the technology increased production of computers and not wheat. But going beyond that would be beyond the scope of this chapter. We'll be able to address those things a little bit more down the line. Just wanted to have you have your minds open to the possibility. Now, we talk about the shape of the production's possibility frontier. It can be a straight line or bow-shaped, much more likely to be bow-shaped. This depends on what happens to the opportunity cost as the economy shifts resources from one industry to another. If the opportunity cost remains constant, the PPF is a straight line. In the previous example, we looked at the opportunity cost of a computer was always 10 tons of wheat. So every time you produced another unit of computers, you lost 10 tons of wheat. If the opportunity cost of a good rises as more of the good is produced, the PPF will be bow-shaped. And we're going to talk a little more about that now. Why the PPF might be bow-shaped? As the economy shifts resources, say in this example from beer to mountain bikes, hopefully you're not doing both at the same time, that could be dangerous. The production's possibilities curve, or frontier, I should say, becomes steeper. The opportunity cost of mountain bikes increases. So as you move away from producing, or as you produce more beer, the opportunity cost lost of producing bikes is actually a little more steep. And we're going to cover the bow-shaped a little bit more moving forward. At point A, most workers are producing beer. Okay, so we have more workers producing beer than we do mountain bikes. You just draw an imaginary line down. That's how many mountain bikes you're producing, and this is how much beer you're producing. So most of the workers are producing beer, even those that are better suited to be building mountain bikes. So you do not have to give up much beer to get more bikes. At point A, opportunity cost of mountain bikes is low. There's not a real big rise over run here. So here we're using workers in a more general resources to keep things simple, just like our previous examples. Now at point B, the opportunity cost of mountain bikes is high. So you see this big drop off here. That's a considerable change from producing this many mountain bikes to producing that many mountain bikes. At point B, most workers are producing bikes. You have more producing bikes than you do beer. The few left in the beer are the best brewers. They're the ones that can really turn out some good beer. Producing more bikes would require the shifting of some of the best brewers away from beer production, which doesn't make sense, and causing a big drop in beer output. So this is how you represent that in a production's possibilities frontier. Again, the bow-shaped production's possibilities frontier is more realistic. However, the linear PPF is simpler to work with. We can learn a lot about how the economy works using a linear PPF. In Chapter 3, we'll use a linear PPF to show how trade can make two countries or two individuals better off. Now you should note in the problems and applications portion at the end of this chapter, problem 4 asks you to construct a PPF for an economy with 3 different workers named Larry, Moe, and Curly, each with a different opportunity cost. That PPF ends up having 3 line segments, one for each worker, which very roughly approximates a bow shape. After you work through and understand this problem, it should not be hard for you to understand the following. The more different kinds of workers and more generally resources there are, the closer the PPF will resemble a smooth bow shape. So I want to go ahead and encourage you to work through that problems and applications at the end of this chapter, specifically problem 4, which will illustrate that in an actual economy like the U.S., there are millions of different workers with different opportunity costs, different skill sets. Some of them are great brewers, some of them are good at building bikes, and so on and so forth. So a smooth bow-shaped production's possibilities frontier is a nearly perfect approximation of the actual production's possibilities frontier. So the summary of the production's possibilities frontier, the PPF, shows all combinations of 2 goods that an economy can possibly produce given its resources and technology. Like I say, given the number of labor hours they have and existing technology. The PPF illustrates the concepts of trade-off and opportunity cost, efficiency and inefficiency, unemployment and economic growth. Remember, if you're inside of the PPF, it's inefficient. You're going to have some unemployment because you're not using all your labor hours. And then also the bow-shaped PPF illustrates the concept of increasing opportunity cost. Now, looking at the 2 different forms of economics, main forms of economics, micro and macroeconomics. Microeconomics is the study of how households and firms make decisions and how they interact in markets. Conversely, macroeconomics is the study of the economy-wide phenomena, including inflation, unemployment, and economic growth. So one's big picture, one's individuals. These 2 branches of economics are closely intertwined. They overlap a good bit, yet they are distinct. They address different questions. I would add microeconomics is inherently more behavioral, and macroeconomics is inherently more aggregate. An economist as a policy advisor, as you guys get to know me over the semester, you will find out that my doctoral work was actually in policy as an economist. So this is more or less my field. As economists, or excuse me, as scientists, I'd add as social scientists, economists make positive statements, which is an attempt to describe the world as it is. They're factual statements. Today the temperature is X degrees. As policy advisors, economists make normative statements, which attempt to prescribe how the world should be. I believe that the legislature should take up X policy because I think that would result in the best outcomes. That's subject to my opinion. It's an informed opinion, but it's a normative statement. Positive statements can be confirmed or refuted. They're factual, and normative statements cannot because they're essentially opinions. A good way I like to remember this is positive statements. I'm positive these are the facts. Again, I'm positive these are the facts. That's a positive statement. They're factual. And it's normal to have an opinion. It can be a well-informed opinion, but it's an opinion nonetheless. That's a normative statement. It's normal to have an opinion. So if that helps you remember it, it always helped me when I was back in school. Governments employ many economists for policy advice. An example is the U.S. President has the Council of Economic Advisors, which the author of this textbook, Mankiw, chaired from 2003 to 2005. So economists disagree. I believe, I want to say it was Nixon. I could be wrong. I'll have to update the video if I'm wrong. But Nixon said, I want to find a one-armed economist. And the people in the room chuckled and said, why is that? He said, well, every time I ask my economist a question, he typically gives me one answer and then always says, well, on the other hand, this is a possibility as well. As an economist, thinking like an economist, you're supposed to think through both sides, the costs and the benefits. So economists often give conflicting policy advice. They have different positive statements and different normative statements, certainly a lot of opinion between economists of how things should be handled. So sometimes they disagree about the validity of different positive theories about the world, the economy, how things are working. They may have different values, therefore the different normative views about what policies should be used to accomplish. Yet there are many propositions in which most economists agree. We'll cover those a little bit more over the course of this semester. As a summary, as scientists, economists try to explain the world by using models with appropriate assumptions, very broad yet appropriate assumptions. You don't want to assume away things that aren't worth assuming away. However, we have to find a way to make a static analysis of a very dynamic situation. The two simple models covered in this chapter, the circular flow diagram where we looked at the households and the firms, and the production's possibilities frontier. Microeconomics studies the behavior of consumers and firms and their interactions in the markets, and macroeconomics studies the economy as a whole. As policy advisors, economists offer advice on how to improve the world. You can learn much more by reading this chapter. I certainly would encourage you to do so. Again, take a look at problem 4 in the application section to help you with the production's possibilities frontier and help you better understand why the PPF is bow-shaped. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to send me a message or come by office hours. Thank you, and I will see you for the next lecture.